Empress Myeongseong. She was a queen, a visionary, but more importantly, the biggest threat to Japan's imperial rule, and one morning, she paid the ultimate price for her political ambitions, her body, sliced in half and burned. The culprits, members of her own court, her father-in-law, and a power-hungry Japanese general. This is the story of one of the most shocking murders in East Asian history. On October 19, 1851, a young girl was born into Korea's noble Yo-Hung-min clan, destined to change the course of a nation. But few could have imagined that this orphan, left to fend for herself at just 8 years old, would rise to become the most powerful woman in Korea. Her name, Queen Min, the woman Japan feared the most. From the very beginning, Min's life was marked by survival. After the death of her parents, she was left without protection or allies in a ruthless society. However, Min's weakness became her biggest asset. You see, despite her background, she had the blood of a noble coursing through her veins, which meant she had close ties to the royal court, a connection that changed her fate. She was handpicked by King Gojong's father, the 26th king of the Joseon dynasty, and the first emperor of the Korean Empire, who ruled Korea from 1864 to 1907. But why would the king choose an orphan as a bride for the future king? Well, in his eyes, she was politically harmless. Her lack of family connections made her the perfect woman to stand by King Gojong's side. But as time would tell, the king's father had made a terrible assumption. Against expectations, Min did not spend her time gossiping or hosting tea parties. She wasn't impressed by her husband's drinking or his love of lavish feasts. In fact, she despised them. So, what did she do? Well, the queen spent most of her time buried in books about history, philosophy, and religion. What's interesting is that the empress was particularly fond of tobacco, and yet she remained deeply loyal to Korean tradition. Canadian-born Margarita Arlena Ham, who traveled to Korea and met Queen, wrote in her travels that, unlike the Empress of Japan, whom I have seen, Queen Min refuses utterly to add foreign ornaments to her person, and she relies almost wholly upon Korean products for the articles of her toilet. And it's this stoic and dignified personality that made Min the ruler of tomorrow. By 1871, she had carved out her own place in Korean politics, an impressive feat because the country was at the center of a geopolitical storm. Back then, Korea was not on good terms with its neighboring countries, including Japan, China, and the West. Things were taking a huge turn in a way that would have dramatic implications for the next 80 years. But Min didn't falter. First, she eliminated King Gojong's powerful concubines, removing any influence that threatened her hold over the court. Then, she solidified her position within the royal marriage. By the early 1880s, Korea's society was on the brink of collapse, and Min recognized that survival meant reform. Inspired by the writings of Chinese diplomat Hwang Junxian, particularly his essay Korean Strategy, she envisioned a bold new path for her country. She also decided to open Korea to Western trade and diplomacy after 20 years. However, her primary strategy throughout her time as queen was to resolve the conflict between Korea and Japan in the late 19th century. Meanwhile, the king himself remained a passive figure. He was more interested in enjoying the pleasures of life than ruling a country, and it's this proactiveness that made Min a target in the eyes of her enemy. With the empress working to make Korea a better place, the shadowy Japanese figures who felt threatened by her work began plotting to remove her. As the 19th century neared its end, Japan was becoming increasingly aggressive in its expansion, and Queen Min was the last obstacle in their path. Unfortunately, it's an obstacle that Japan managed to remove in the most brutal way possible on the dawn of October 9, 1895. That day, at around 4 a.m., Afanasy Ivanovich Saradin Sabatin, a Russian architect serving as an aide to American General William McIntyre Dai in Seoul, woke up after hearing loud noises echoing from the inner court of Gyeongbokgung Palace. Naturally, they made their way to the courtroom to check out the commotion, and what they saw was a brutal massacre. More than 1,000 men, including Japanese agents, members of the Japanese-trained Korean Huliande Regiment, and hired assassins, surrounded the palace. The palace gates were opened by none other than pro-Japanese Korean guards, allowing the assassins to commit the most heinous crimes. According to Sabetan, the soldiers were dragging women, Korean ladies in the palace, by the hair of the head, hurling them off the veranda and kicking them as they fell. The palace had turned into a battlefield. Sabatayan sensed that his life was in danger, and so he decided to escape. However, while he was silently trying to make a move for it, he was stopped by a Korean official and a group of Japanese soldiers. They grabbed him and dragged him across the courtyard, demanding one thing: where is the queen? It's a memory that pained Sabatayan until his dying breath. I protested that I did not know, and they were proceeding to handle me pretty roughly when the Japanese individual again came up. I appealed to him for protection, and when he had heard what the others had to say, he also asked me in English where the queen was. I repeated that I did not know and asked for an escort to take me out of the palace. Eventually, he was released and even managed to escape the palace. But Queen Min was not so fortunate. The assassins murdered 2 women before finally locating her, and when they did, they proceeded to brutalize and murder her in the most horrific ways imaginable. According to eyewitness accounts, including Sabatayan, the killer jumped on her chest 3 times before cutting off her head with a sword. Her body was then doused in oil and burned in an attempt to prevent identification. According to a letter from the British Consul General in Seoul to Sir N.R. O'Connor, dated October 11, 1895. There was another witness to the Queen's murder, including one of the ladies of the palace who says she saw the Queen cut down by Japanese assassins, an old nurse of the Queen who saw the dead body, a Korean officer of the guard who also says that he saw the body, and a palace servant who saw the Queen's body being carried by the Japanese assassins to a wood adjoining the Queen's apartments, where it was placed on a pile of brushwood and burnt so as to render it unrecognizable. Ernest Sato also mentioned this incident in his diary on October 14, 1895. It was in his presence that the Queen was killed, either in his room or hers. It is said her head was cut off, which looks like a Japanese performance. No doubt Japan were mixed up at it. General Miura was at the palace 5 minutes later in his uniform. According to the Korean Repository, an English-language magazine published in Seoul, the Japanese troops took command of the place. However, the white-coated troops were asked to stand near the royal chambers but were excluded from the violence that took place. And just at the beginning of the alarm sounds, as the smashing in of a gate was heard in Her Majesty's quarters, and later on the reports of 2 shots were heard. But as to what really transpired, there are many conflicting reports. But a ready entrance had been found, and a mad search for Her Majesty, the Queen, began. Ruffians, probably Soshi, who seemed to have joined the insurgent troops, led the way. The report is that they seized women by the hair of the head and dragged them about to make them lead the way to Her Majesty. But the likely work was done in one of these 2-story structures, where it is now admitted the Queen had taken refuge. Here, the minister of the royal household Yi Kyung-jik was found, who was cut down and killed. In the upper story, a number of ladies were found, and the first one to be seized was the crown princess, who was dragged about by the hair, beaten, wounded with a sword, and thrown down the stairs. It was difficult to discover which one among the women was the queen, and in the hope of making sure work, 4 women were brutally murdered. A palace maid says one of them was Her Majesty, and that she was knocked down, trampled, and jumped upon, and finally dispatched by the sword. And just like that, one of Korea's most powerful empresses was removed from her throne. That said, there has always been a long list of questions surrounding the queen's gruesome murder. For starters, there was no clear indication whether she was alive or dead when the kerosene was poured over her body. It was also revealed by multiple resources that before she was finally set on fire, she may have been sexually assaulted as a final outrage. In his diary, Yoon Chi-ho wrote, "I would be the last man in the world to admit that the queen's reign was a good one. I may even advocate her deposition if she could not be in any other way made to give up her intrigues and evil favorites. But I am the last man in the world to approve her cruel murder committed by Japanese assassins. Foreigners, without an exception, are disgusted with the parties, Korean and Japanese, who committed the deed." That said, the culprits behind the queen's murder were not a secret. Much of the evidence pointed towards Miura Goro, the Japanese minister of Korea. It's believed that in an attempt to avoid losing Korea to other powers, Miura chose to remove the queen from her throne. However, he was not alone. The queen's father-in-law, Taiwan-kun, had also played a part in planning the assassination. Back in 1882, Taiwan-kun was removed from power and kidnapped to China before the outbreak of the First Sino-Japanese War. He was released from prison after 3 years and returned to Korea. However, it was too late as he had lost all his power to Min. She was a prominent political figure by then, and that's when the ultimate conflict started taking root. Unlike Queen Min, Taiwan-kun considered Japan a reliable ally. He even championed a pro-Japan policy. Meanwhile, Queen Min had other plans. After Japan won the First Sino-Japanese War, the Empress made active efforts to stop the country's takeover of Korea. She began to cultivate ties with Russia as a counterweight to Japanese influence, a move that infuriated Japanese officials. As time passed by, his resentment grew, and that eventually led him to join hands with the Japanese government to murder his daughter-in-law, a scheme that proved to be too successful. Soon after the queen's death, Taiwan-kun forcefully occupied the royal court. In his telegram to Lord Salisbury, dated October 10, 1895, N.R. O'Connor revealed that the king's father, with Japanese and Korean Japanese drilled troops, entered the king's palace and took forcible possession of it. Later on, November 24, 1895, then Japanese Foreign Minister Shigenobu Okuma told Sato that the murder of the queen was contrived by the Taiwan-kun with the aid, perhaps, of a few Japs, Soshi, and that the result had been to put all the foreigners in Korea against Japan. More recently, a former Japanese diplomat confessed to taking part in the assassination of Korean Empress Myeongseong. Kim Moon-ja, a historian and the author of the book on the assassination, chose Ohi Satsugai to Nihon Jin, analyzed some letters that said, "Among the assassins, it was my role to enter." Climbing up the wall, finally reaching the rear private royal residence, we killed the queen. The letters had been sent to Teisho Takeishi, the diplomat's best friend in his hometown of Nakadori, currently Nagaoka. They dated from November 17, 1894 to October 18, 1895, a few days after the assassination. The diplomat further described how he felt after the assassination, writing, "We were stunned as the assassination, was unexpectedly easy." The letters were written with a brush in a cursive style, traditional forms of Chinese characters, as well as Japanese hiragana and katakana characters. Kim stated that, according to him, the letters seemed to be authentic. He said, "The details of the assassination and the accounts of his family in the letters convinced me that they are genuine letters written by Horiguchi." He further said, "I got a raw feeling of shock reading that the then incumbent diplomat was involved in the killing of the queen of the country to which he was sent. These are important documents that give us a key to unlocking the details behind the incident. of which much is still unknown. In the end, Queen Min's assassination shook East Asian history. There were large-scale protests. Japan was ashamed, and Muragoro was arrested. However, the trial was a sham. Non-Japanese witnesses were not called, and key evidence was disregarded. All defendants were acquitted on the grounds of insufficient evidence, despite the court's acknowledgement of a conspiracy to commit murder. Miura even went on to have a successful career in the Japanese government. However, Korea never forgot. To this day, Empress Myeongseong is remembered as a national heroine, often compared to figures like Joan of Arc. And so at the end of the day, Queen Min's murder was more than a personal tragedy. It was a seismic event in East Asian history, and a reminder of the ruthless lengths Imperial Japan would go to secure its interests. And that's not all for today. Don't forget to leave a like and check out other videos on our channel.